What is happening, fishing friends? Welcome to another episode, and today, well, we're talking about something that I got a multitude of comments and private messages about from my last video. Comment below, let me know actually if you would like to see a video like that, me backlashing, and then how I go about resolving it. How do I set the brakes? How do I set the spool tension? Comment below, that'd be kind of a fun video to do. Yes, we are going to talk about backlashes and brake adjustments on your Baitcaster, but I really wanted to break this down into a series. See, I didn't want to just go into how I remove a backlash and all that because it's just putting a band-aid on the real problem. Why are you backlashing in the first place? So this series will consist of 3 videos. The first is going to be understanding the different types of brakes on Baitcasters, how to adjust them, what do they do. The second video is going to be taking these out on the water and getting them dialed in. What do you change? What do you tweak? How do you get your Baitcaster dialed in so you're not backlashing, or at least backlashing far less than you are now? A lot of it's just going to come with time. And the final video will be, yes, inevitably you are going to backlash on a Baitcaster at some point in time. So how do you get that picked out? How do you clear out your backlashes? That'll be the last video. In my opinion, you really need to start out with understanding your Baitcaster, the types of brakes it has on it, and how you tune that to work for you to reduce backlashes. So today we're going to cover everything from magnetic brakes, centrifugal brakes, your spool tension knob, and the most important brake of all, your thumbs. Starting out with the old magnetic brakes, what are they? Well, with nowadays Baitcasters, they're all pretty much externally adjustable. I don't know if there's any that are adjustable from the inside. To my knowledge, they're all on the outside with a little dial, less brake or more brake, depending on which way you turn the switch. But what is that actually doing? Well, this side plate that you take off, the side plate that is opposite of your reel handle, will come off or stay attached depending on the Baitcaster that you have. And inside there, you'll notice there's a line of brakes. Those are magnets. And these magnets will move closer or farther from your spool depending on how it's adjusted. You can see now they're a little bit of ways back there, pushed back. As I turn the adjustment knob, you can see what happens. As I move that, it moves those brakes up and closer when you put it on max brakes. So it's just taking those brakes and either moving them closer or farther away from your spool. So how does this all really work? Well, you take the aluminum spool and you'll notice it doesn't stick to it. It's not magnetic. Now, the aluminum spool itself acts as a conductor. Current is generated by the spool when it moves through the opposing force of the magnetic field. The magnets put off their own magnetic field. Once the spool starts turning, those forces oppose each other and it slows the spool down. Now, if the force of the spool was working together with the magnets, it would actually help speed the spool up. But because they're opposing, it creates a magnetic force or drag and it slows your spool down. So that's how these brakes work. Even though the spool is not ferromagnetic, it's still slowing it down. Now, there are a couple important variables in this. Remember, we talked about the magnetic brakes either moving closer or farther away from the spool. When you turn this and these brakes move closer in toward the spool, when you put these up to max, it's creating more of a magnetic force and slowing that spool down more. The faster this spool spins, the more force it's going to be created. Now, the thing about magnetic brakes, and this is why some people don't like them, is you cannot turn them off. So even when you have these on minimum, there's still going to be a little bit of force created. I remember back in physics class in high school, we actually went over something that portrays this very well. If you check out Lenz's law, go out and YouTube Lenz's law, it explains this whole magnetic brake phenomenon perfectly. I don't know, Mr. Wizard would be proud though. Next up are the centrifugal brakes. And yes, the centrifugal brakes are activated by centrifugal force. So you can think of these type of brakes as egg beaters. If you're mixing a cake, you've got a bowl and your electric beaters are going around and around. If you lift those beaters up out of the bowl, it's shooting cake batter everywhere, right? Well, the same holds true with these brakes. As your spool is spinning really, really fast, it's taking these little brake pads right here, these little white pads. As you turn this up, it's going to allow more of these to come out. And as your spool spins really fast, it's taking those little brake pads and pushing them out. As those little brake pads are getting pushed out, they're going to rub on the inside of this brake ring, this little brass ring on your side plate here, the side plate that comes off your reel. They're going to rub on this little brass ring and they're going to create force and friction, which creates drag and slows your spool down. Now, not all centrifugal brakes are created equally. Some of them are adjusted internally. So you can see on these brakes, you have to actually take the side plate off and turn this little knob here, get them adjusted that way. You have to go inside of it or internally adjusted. The same goes for this type of reel. You actually have to take the side plate off to get to these little brakes, and there you can see them there. As the spool spins really, really fast, there's a little spring there that's keeping it back, but as that spins really fast, it pushes those brakes out, and it's going to rub on the inside of that ring on the side plate. That's how these work. Again, this is an internally adjusted centrifugal braking system, so if you take your side plate off and see something like this, these little pins that you have to click on and off, you can see how it's on, but if you click it down, it's off now. So that's how these guys work. But there are also externally adjusted centrifugal brakes. As you can see, this is a dial. You would think it looks like magnets, but when you flip this baby over, there are no magnets there. It's a brake ring. What in the world's going on here? Well, when you look at the actual Baitcaster, you can see there's a whole different story here. These brakes work just a little bit different. The heavier part is actually in behind. So as this spool spins really fast, it actually takes these little brake pads, the front of it, and pushes it forward as that heavier part is getting rotated and it's trying to push that heavier part out. It's actually taking the top part of this brake and pushing it in. Top front part of that brake is actually going to rub on the inside of that brake ring that we were just talking about here. So what does the actual dial do? Well, the actual dial is going to take this brake ring and move it closer or farther from these little brake pins. And these brake pins are all not the same length. Some are going to be longer and some are shorter, thus applying more or less force as that brake pad gets closer or farther away. Woo, I feel like we need to get Bill Nye here to help explain some of this for us. So now that we've got all this brake stuff out of the way, let's go to the something that all modern day baitcasters have. It's this little knob. It's going to be on the same side as your actual handle here. What is it and what's it do? This happens to be your spool tension knob. You might hear some people refer to this as your cast control knob. It's really the same thing. And what is this doing? Well, as you tighten and loosen this knob, there's a little piece of material in there that's either putting more or less force on your spool. So if you imagine the spool sitting in here like this actual cap pushes on the outside of this spool and slows it down. As you loosen it, it slowly comes off there. You hear people talk about side-to-side play. That's why they've loosened up that spool tension knob enough that it's no longer touching the outside of your spool shaft. It's actually off of it and it allows that spool to move in and out of there. The more pressure you put on this, when you tighten this up and put more pressure on your actual spool shaft, it pushes that spool over this way a little bit. So what does all this really mean? Well, it means that your spool tension knob isn't going to adjust through the cast. It doesn't change. It's a constant force put on your actual spool shaft. To me, it's a direct correlation with your casting distance. You notice now I don't have this very tight. I've loosened it off. And see how nice and free my spool goes there? Not an issue. But as I take this and tighten it down and cinch it down tighter, my spool barely turns. So you can imagine the more you use your actual spool tension, the more tension you put on there, it's going to decrease your casting distance. The more you loosen that up and get comfortable with looser or less spool tension, the farther you're going to be able to cast. The more your spool is able to actually free spool and let out line. But you have to control that, and that's where the brakes come into play. One thing I see beginners doing is really cinching this down. And what they do to overcompensate, they'll throw a few casts and like, man, this thing doesn't cast very far. So to overcompensate for that tight spool, instead of loosening this off and allowing their actual spool to spin a little bit freer, they'll take and they'll cast it really hard. And because oftentimes the brakes aren't actually set where they should be, they've been relying on that tight spool, they cast really hard and you get a backlash right away. So training your thumb, what does it really mean? You hear people say that all the time. Well, you just need to train your thumb. Sit. Good thumb. It's not as much an actual thumb training thing as it is a mental thing. What you're really doing is feeling the speed of your spool and judging how much do I need to actually let off that or how much pressure do I need to put on it to ensure this isn't, fluffing and unraveling. You're really just trying to control the speed of that spool. And the number one thing that I see beginners doing is they'll cock back, throw a huge hard cast and their thumb does, whoop, comes right off of it. So they don't know, have any clue what the spool's doing, if it's going too fast, if they start to feel it fluff up. They're just relying on everything on the Baitcaster. Then I know there are a lot of people out there who'll say, well, if you get your brakes set right, you should never have to use your thumb. Well, yes and no. If you want to just have a nice, comfortable casting experience where you don't ever have to use your thumb and all that, that's fine. However, if you have your brakes set that tight, I think you are cutting into your casting distance. So you need to get just a little bit looser with some of those control where it will just kind of backlash a little bit, but it's no issue if you have your thumb ready. If you feel that starting to unravel and fluff off, okay, you see how much it started to fluff up there? I had to tame it with my thumb a little bit. Just like that clip, you just barely take your thumb and you can see here, I'm just barely touching it when it does that. So it's still spinning, but I'm just barely putting force on it until you feel all those lines and ravels go away. Then you can let that thumb off it again. Because what that means is it's actually allowing the speed of the spool to catch up to your lure. If your lure is going a little bit slower, this spool needs to slow down a little bit so that lure can be pulling off the line at an even rate. So it's not just trying to throw it all everywhere. The reason I stress thumb control is because if there's a little bit of wind or anything like that, and you may have your brakes set really good and you haven't touched them all day, but you start casting into wind and there's just a little bit of an adjustment you need to make. Well, instead of tightening all your brakes up and your spool tension, you feel that starting to backlash, you can just use your thumb. So it makes you a more versatile angler. Also, when you get into things like pitching, skipping, flipping, short casts, little roll casts, you're not going to be using your brakes because you're not going to be getting enough force or distance for those brakes to kick in a lot of times. So on those little short casts, your thumb is everything. And finally, on any cast, what are you doing to stop that cast? You're using your thumb anyway. So you might as well have it down here where it's ready, no matter the distance of the cast, no matter if you're in the wind or not, it doesn't matter. You've got that thumb there ready to go, and it's just one more essential brake on your Baitcaster. So I want to know your thoughts. Please leave me a comment below and let me know, what type of brakes do you like on a baitcaster? Do you like the magnetic brakes? Do you like the centrifugal brakes? Or do you not like either of those? You just like to use your spool tension and your thumb? Let me know below what works for you, because the awesome part about baitcasters and fishing is there's no right answer. So just if you hear your friend say, man, you're doing it wrong, you need to have this set, or oh, your baitcaster doesn't have this, you got the wrong kind. There's no right answer. Find what works for you and roll with it. Now, if you're new to my channel, I want to thank you very much for tuning in and watching. And if you're one of my returning fishing friends, well, I want to give you a YouTube fist bump.